let's have a look and see what have we got about Chanukah. First of all, Chanukah is a very beautiful. It's a very beautiful young. When I was a kid growing up, Chanukah and Purim were the two festivals that were called minor festivals because they're not from the Torah. Not being very literate when I was a kid, I was under the impression that minor, something to do with people that dug coal out of the ground, not realizing that, whatever, E's and O's are interchangeable with each other. But the Chanukah it's a rabbinic mitza. It's a rabbinic Yom Tov. It's not a Yom Tov that appears in the Torah at all, because the whole story of Chanukah, of course, it occurred much later on. And let's have a look and see what we've got. What was the story? So in short, the Greeks had invaded the land of Israel. They'd conquered the land of Israel. They came. The Greeks were very clever, actually. In a lot of their conquests, they had an enormous empire at one point. A lot of the success of what they did was because they didn't try to physically conquer, and just overwhelm the different nations, but rather they tried to what was called Hellenize them, which means that they introduced Greek culture, and they wanted you to carry on. They wanted you to carry on having your own identity, but they wanted your national identity to blend together with Greek identity, with the Greek culture as well. So you could be an American, like how would you say it, an American Greek, or a Greek American, or a British Greek, or whatever it is, right? And that's what they try to do. They were very clever, because at the end of the day, what they did was national identities started to become less important, right? The minute, what makes national identity so important is because it's a unit of people that all share the same culture, and that gives them a certain connection that they don't have with other people. And that's one of the reasons, for example, why different countries that speak the same language. So the language is basically the same, but each country has got its own form of speaking it. So, for example, American English and British English, different forms of Spanish that are spoken throughout the world. Somebody knows exactly where somebody's coming from by listening to the way that they speak, and that very much defines who the person is. What the Greeks did was very clever, and it was very subtle as well. They introduced Greek culture, and that way your national identity is slowly but surely becoming less pronounced, and then it means that you can integrate yourself into the greater Greek Empire, and it doesn't matter where you go. You can go into any country, whether it's for commercial reasons or just for travel, and you'll feel at home over there because lots of things are going to be very similar. And that's what the Greeks that came to Israel, that's what they wanted to do, right? That was their idea. They were going to take the Jewish culture, and they were going to dilute it with a little bit of Greek culture as well. And they almost succeeded. They were very successful. Greek culture in its day was the most modern culture. They were at the vanguard of architecture, of literature, of philosophy. They were considered to be extremely cultural in their day. And they came to Israel, and they had a lot of people who were very interested in becoming Hellenized. And things looked very bad, actually, for the Jewish people. The Jewish people were in droves, not converting per se, but they were converting their mindset into becoming, cultural Greeks. And until along came a small band of Kohanim, which in and of itself is something which is rather odd. We'll talk about that as well in a moment. But along came a small band of priests, and they decided that enough was enough. Something happened. The Greeks can't try to put up a statue in the temple, and one of the priests killed the person who was doing it, and that sparked off the beginning of a rebellion. A rebellion which ultimately was successful and drove the Greeks out of Israel for a little while, not for too long, unfortunately, but it did the job. And those people were called the Hashmonin, or the Maccabees. We're talking about afterwards. Yeah, for sure afterwards, because after Alexander the Great died, that's when the Greek Empire was split up, and that's when people started fighting over Israel. You had the Syrian part of the Greek Empire and the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire, but they wanted to get their hands on Israel because obviously Israel, even in those days, was famous for its delectable falafel balls, and everybody wanted them. I think they were going to be good for their catapults and their war machines. There was a battle, a war took place, and believe it or not, these Kohanim, these priests, were victorious. Now, this is an extraordinary thing. First of all, the priests, I don't know if anybody here, is anybody here? No, nobody here is a Kohen, right? But the priests they didn't really go to war, right? It was forbidden for them to come into contact with dead bodies. They had to serve in the temple. They had to stay at a certain level of spiritual purity. And for them to go to war was something really quite extraordinary. Aside from that, they were fighting against the largest and most successful war machine in the world at the time. And yet they managed to succeed in pushing the Greeks out of Israel temporarily, only for a couple of generations, and then everything started falling apart again because Jews don't get on very well with Jews. So what was going on was there was rampant assimilation. The Greeks came along and they were very clever, so they decided that they were going to make a few decrees to stop people from being so overtly Jewish. The things that they made decrees about were, they made a decree against making a Brit Milah, against making a circumcision.
This is the after they invaded again?
No, first time around, right? When they conquered the land the first time, before they were expelled, they made a decree that you shouldn't make a Brit Milah. They made a decree that you shouldn't keep Shabbat, and they made a decree that you shouldn't read from the Torah. Now, if you understand anything at all about Jewish theology and Jewish culture, you'll understand that the connection between Brit Milah, that's the individual sign that he's Jewish. By stopping people from doing that, then they're taking away the child's ability to identify himself obviously as being Jewish. The idea of Shabbat is the same kind of a thing. That's more of a communal thing, where everybody comes together and celebrates Shabbat together. That's being taken away from them as well. And the reading of the Torah is something which is, that's the educational dimension of who the Jewish people are. And what they were doing was, in effect, they were trying to dampen down the individual, communal, and educational dimension of Jewish life, knowing that if they did that, then at some point it wouldn't take very long before the integration of the Jewish community into the more Hellenistic lifestyle would take place. It would be painless, right? They wouldn't have to fight for anything. What is fascinating is, if anybody here is familiar with a shul service on Shabbat in the morning, so you'll know that we read the Torah, right? After we put away the Torah, then they read what's called the Haftorah, right? The Haftorah is normally something which is taken from the prophets, and it's normally got something to do with whatever's going on either in that week's Torah reading or to do with the time of the year. The Greeks, interestingly enough, allowed the Haftorah to be read they allowed the prophets to be read. They didn't allow the Torah to be read, and that's where the custom came from to read. The rabbis got together and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We'll introduce Torah readings from the prophets instead of from the Torah itself. And that way we'll have some kind of a resemblance of what things were like before the Greeks came along. And that's why the idea of reading something which has got a connection to the week's Parsha, to the week's Torah portion, or to what's going on during the year, that's where it came from. But the question really needs to be asked is what possessed the Greeks to allow them to do that? Which means everybody here, I would imagine, knows that the Torah is made up of three sections. There's Torah, which is the Bible, there's a Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and then there's Ksuvim, which are the writings. Altogether, that's called Tanakh, right? And that was something which existed at the time of the Greeks as well. What on earth possessed the Greeks to say, okay, you can't read from the Torah, but you can read from the prophets? Why didn't they just outlaw everything? So the idea is actually something very deep. The Greeks were really very clever. They understood that if they outlawed Tanakh in its entirety, right, which is the Torah and the prophets and all of the writings, if they wouldn't allow any of that to be read, then what would the Jews do? They would just go underground. That's all. Right? They'll start having underground services somewhere, and they won't be able to eradicate, they won't be able to push into the Jewish educational system will remain intact. So what did they do? They took out Torah. They said you're not allowed to read from the Torah, but you can read from the prophets instead. Why is that? Because the Torah itself is something, the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, is something that we can't understand that without the oral Torah as well. Right? Without the oral Torah, we're stuck in just understanding basics of what it is that the Torah is talking about. So right now, in Bereshit, it's a little less complicated because that's a whole series of stories. But the minute we get into, from Pashas Mishpatim onwards, we get into all of the laws and the various things that we need to know. So without the oral Torah, we're stuck. So for example, God says, I want you to eat kosher animals, but he doesn't explain what that means. Right? How does an animal get onto my plate? Right? How does a meatball get onto my plate and be kosher? Right? That's not explained in the Torah Shebichsav, in the written Torah. That only appears in the oral Torah. The Greeks understood that, and they understood that what they're really trying to do is undermine the educational dimension, which is going to come from the written and the oral Torah together. So they said, here, you can read from the prophets. Reading from the prophets was like giving them a little like throwing them a bone, right? Why were the prophets okay to read from? Because if you read through the prophets, even though it helps to read through them with the commentaries, but nevertheless, if you read through the prophets, what do you see? That the prophets, normally the story has got a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story that can be followed, which means that you can read the prophets in shul on Shabbos morning and come out, and it hasn't piqued your interest and got you to start looking around and investigating and studying, because it's a story in and of itself. So along came the Greeks, and that's what they tried to impose upon us. Interestingly enough, after all of this was taken away, after the decrees were taken away, the Haftarah, the custom of reading the Haftarah remained. That's where the custom comes from, which means that even though we read the regular Torah portion each Shabbat, we also read the Haftarah that's affiliated to the Torah portion as well, even though we don't really need to do it anymore because we're already reading the Torah portion itself, but nevertheless the rabbis left it in as some kind of a zeicher, some kind of a remembrance to what took place. Along come the Greeks, again, very clever. You want to be Jewish? Be Jewish. There's no problem being Jewish whatsoever. But just be Jewish with a Greek flavor. So I would imagine, and again, I don't know if this is true historically, but I would imagine that if the Greeks were successful, which they were over here, then you probably had the very first kosher-style restaurants here in Eretz Yisrael, because that's exactly what the Greeks were happy to do. Right? You want to retain your ethnic identity, right? You want your culinary identity. You want to eat cholent on Shabbos morning. That's fine. Just it shouldn't be kosher. That's all. You want to eat Jewish style foods and even for example over Jewish history there have been very very assimilated, very secular Jewish playwrights. And Jewish novelists, and their works are incredibly Jewish, and the Greeks would have been thrilled with something like that. Which means that again, to retain your Jewish flavor, right, to retain your Jewish identity, and to read novels and plays and all kinds of things that have been written by people who are completely secular, but they've just got that Jewish. That's exactly what the Greek philosophy was. That's what they were trying to teach. Which be Jewish, but just be Jewish with a Greek flavor. And along came the Kohanim, the priests, and they said, we can't do this anymore. We're going to have to go to fight. We're going to go to war, says the Ramban Nachmanides, for the first and last time in Jewish history. The Jewish people went to war in order to be able to learn Torah. A later commentary, right? But he's explaining what the significance of Chanukah really is. It's a very strange time in Jewish history. Jewish history is normally very simple. People come along and they try to kill us. Right? It just repeats itself over and over again. The Greeks weren't trying to kill us physically. They were trying to kill us spiritually. And and says the Ramban Nachmanides that this is the first time that the Jews had to go to war, not to defend themselves physically. We've done that on many occasions in the past, and we did it on many occasions afterwards as well. But to go to war in order to be able to learn Torah. If you were prepared to become a Hellenized Jew, you were perfectly safe. No one was going to try to kill you. Quite the opposite. They wanted things to flourish over here. They really did. They just wanted it to flourish in their way. And in many respects, that's a very dangerous place to be. Like when you've got an identifiable enemy who's physically trying to annihilate you. So however terrible that is, however terrifying that is, but at least you know who they are. Right? When you've got people who are trying to get rid of your spiritual identity in a very subtle, in a very what are we going to say? In a very quiet, underhand way, then that's much more dangerous because it's difficult. It's difficult to recognize who's your enemy and who's not. Here it says in this week's Torah portion, it says that before Jacob meets Esav, they haven't met each other for the last 22 years. They haven't met, and he's understandably a little concerned about this because he ran away because Esav wanted to kill him, and now he's scared that maybe things haven't changed. So he prays to God and he says, "Hatzileni na, save me please, miyad achi, miyad Esav, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esav." Ask the Briskerov, Jacob only has one brother. What's he got to say? Save me from my brother, save me from Esav. Right? If he's asking to be saved from his brother, he's being asked to be saved from Esav. He asked to be saved from Esav, he's being asked to be saved from his brother. So the Briskerov says exactly that idea. He says Esav appears, and he says he appeared like that throughout history as well. Esav has appeared sometimes as a physical enemy and sometimes as a spiritual enemy. And when he's a physical enemy, that's Hatzileni miyad Esav, from Esav, the physical enemy that I have to be concerned about. But what's perhaps even more concern is Hatzileni na miyad Achi, when he behaves like my brother, and he wants to draw me close, and he wants to, in an underhand way, he wants to undermine my connection, my spiritual connection. That's even more of a concern than the physical danger that a person might be in. And I thought, I had this idea. I thought like this. It says that they have this rather after they meet each other, they have this rather strange dialogue where Esav says, "Come on, let's go together. We'll travel together to wherever we need to get to." And Yaakov says to Esav, he says, "No," he says, "I you know what? I've got small children with me, and I'm scared that you'll go too fast, and they'll end up, it'll be too difficult for them, and maybe something terrible will happen. You go on ahead, and we'll meet up." I was thinking, I'm sure I saw this once somewhere, but I was thinking like this, maybe the dialogue, sometimes you have a dialogue on parallel lines, which means that Esav is saying, "Come on, let's travel together." And Yaakov is saying, I don't want to travel together with you because I'm scared that my children will be influenced by what they see. Right? Esav is not this real righteous, pious guy, right? And he says, "I'm scared. My children are young. They're very impressionable. And maybe they'll see something that they shouldn't see over there, and if they do, then it's gonna end up doing something terrible to them." So he says, "Hey, you go on ahead. I don't, it's like it's as if Yaakov is saying, I'm okay with you. I can travel with you. Nothing's going to happen to me, especially after having spent 22 years with Lavan, right? Nothing's going to happen to me, but I am scared for my children."
Well, what's he scared? I mean, he's a rabbinic showing.
Yes, I think he's scared over here. The scare over here, the fear over here is that they're going to be influenced by, Esav is this larger-than-life figure, right? Very, very successful, very physically successful, What can I tell you? It's like the rabbi, the rabbi's children living next door to some humongously successful multimillionaire with fancy cars parked outside, and maybe they'll say to themselves, "You know what? Wow, this is a neat lifestyle. I wish I could do that." Right? So the rabbi himself, who lives next door, he's not bothered. It doesn't bother him. He's not bothered by what he sees. But the children are very impressionable, and the children were young. Right, and at that time the children were young, and he didn't want them to be influenced by Esav and Esav's anti-Torah ideology. Interestingly enough, the Greeks are the continuity. The Greek Empire is the continuity of the Empire of Edom, which was then superseded by the Roman Empire, and that's really what's we're living inside of today. Western culture is something which very much revolves around this Edom and this idea of what it is that the Greeks were trying to do. There's nobody today standing over the Jewish people and telling them, here in America, for example, there's nobody telling them that they've got to integrate themselves into American society in the way that, in this particular way. No one's telling them that today. But that's exactly what they're doing, right? The Jewish communities all over the place, the Jewish individuals all over the place. That's what's happening, right? We're being influenced by the culture. We're being influenced by the environment and the atmosphere, and it's taking its toll, that's for sure. Aristotle was, without a doubt, one of the most enormous influences on thought, on philosophy in general. In many respects, Aristotle is considered to be the Zaidi, the grandfather of philosophical thought, and the Rambam Maimonides, who's considered to be one of, if not the greatest Jewish philosopher who, in Jewish history, was very much influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle's philosophy is very logical, very rational, very analytical, and the Rambam Maimonides was very much influenced by that. Aristotle, he didn't really believe in God. I mean, the jury's out a little bit about whether or not there was a God which had no connection whatsoever, because God of course is perfect and human beings are not perfect, so God doesn't have any connection with human beings. Really, Aristotle's belief system was such that the more brilliant you were, the closer you were to being like God. And you might be absolutely flabbergasted and amazed to hear that Aristotle looked at himself as being the most brilliant person, and therefore he was the closest to some kind of a godlike figure. What a surprise. But Aristotle did believe, interestingly enough, in the concept of accumulation of knowledge, which means each generation is going to accumulate more and more knowledge. They'll build on the individuals inside of the generation until at some point that somebody is going to know everything. He very much believed in the religion of the intellect, Aristotle, and of course Greek philosophy is very much built upon. He wasn't the first of the Greek philosophers, but he was definitely, I think, the most dominant of the Greek philosophers, and his philosophies are still being felt up to and including today. What happened? So the Jews came back. They managed to drive the Greeks out of the land of Israel. They drove them, first of all, out of Jerusalem, and they drove them out of the temple area. That was a big thing, right? When did that happen? On the 24th of Kislev. Right, on the 24th of Kislev, they drove out the Greeks from Jerusalem, and they wanted to come and rededicate the temple. And on the 25th of Kislev, that's when the rededication took place. That's when they began to that's when they lit the menorah anew. They started relighting the menorah again on the 25th of Kislev. Now, it's an important date. Why is that? We're not commemorating the end of the war. Right, a few days ago, it was Armistice Day. When was it? November the 11th, no? Mm-hmm. Right, November the 11th was Armistice Day in Europe. It's a very important day. It's a day that they commemorate the end of originally it was the First World War. Now it's both World Wars together, or is it still just the First World War?
It had to be.
Whatever. But originally it was it was the Victory Day of the First World War, and then they had a second one for the Second World War, Victory Day for the Second World War. In Judaism, we don't normally have a Victory Day, but rather the day after is considered to be the important day, because that's when we go back to being able to do what we can do. Which means that the battle over Jerusalem and the temple came to an end on the 24th of Kislev. We don't commemorate on the 24th of Kislev, but rather we commemorate on the next day, on the 25th. And the word Chanukah, which is spelled Chet, Nun, Vav, Chof, Hey, Chanukah. So the commentaries explain is comprised of two words, Chanu, which means to rest, and Ka, Chof Hei, on the 25th. Which means, again, what we're commemorating over here is the ability to be able to go back and to connect together with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God, in the way that we're supposed to, not through upheaval and not through war and not through victories, but rather coming back to the temple and being able to connect together with God in the right way. Chanukah. And it's interesting that the word Chanukah also means to inaugurate, because they were rededicating the temple. And Chanukah comes from the word chinuch. Chinuch means educate, education, right? It's a very fundamental idea. It really is, that the concept of Chanukah is a concept of rededicating the temple. It's a concept of returning back to God, and the fundamental dimension of Chanukah is chinuch. Right, that we have to educate. How are we going to do this? How are we going to gain that connection back to God again? We're going to do it through education. There is a verse, King Solomon says, Chanoch lenar al pidako, that every child should be educated according to his abilities, to who he is. Right? There's only, I don't know if you're familiar with Jewish personalities. But there was a very, very important personality called Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, who lived in Germany, lived in Frankfurt 100 plus years ago, 180 years ago, whenever it was. And he was a master educationalist. And he writes an interesting critique. I think only Rav Hirsch could ever do this. He writes an interesting critique against Isaac, because Jacob and Esau, the Midrash says that Jacob and Esau were pretty much the same until they were 13 years old. You couldn't really differentiate between them. Not talking physically, he's talking about the way that they were brought up. And Rav Hirsch says, how can you do that? They were very different personalities. Right? How on earth could you? It's true that they were twins, right? But how on earth, Jacob and Esau?
Super hairy, though.
Not physically. He's talking about their personalities, gotcha. Right? And that's exactly what Rav Hirsch is saying. Like, how on earth can you treat them equally, right? Send them off to the same schools and expect the same things from them if they're so very different. Chanoch lenar pidako means that we need to educate every child according to who he is. Right? Some children are more studious, some children are less studious, some children have a greater ability to understand, some children have less of an ability to understand. It's our job as parents, in Mitzvah Hashem, you'll also have this job as well, right? But the job of a parent is to identify each child, what their strengths and their weaknesses are, and allow that child to flourish according to who they are, and not like cookie cutter, right? Not to have everybody coming out exactly the same. And I heard once from Rav Pesach Krohn the most astonishing idea. It's really very, very beautiful. He said it in the name of one of the Hasidic Rebbes, that the word chanoch, in chanoch lenar pidako, that we should educate every child according to his ability, the word chanoch should really be spelled chet, nun, vav, chaf. Chanoch. However, Shlomo HaMelech spelled chanoch without a vav. Chet, nun, chaf. That's a little bit like spelling education with a K. So David, who's from England, he thinks that's funny, and the Americans don't really understand what the big deal is. Isn't that how you spell it? Right? Actually, you know where they're really holding a spell? Spelling chanoch without a vav, it seems like it's a spelling mistake. Like, what would possess King Solomon to spell, education the wrong way? So Rav Pesach Krohn said in the name of one of the Hasidic Rebbes, I can't remember who it was, he said that the Vav is missing in Chanoch to teach us that every single one of us, in education, every single one of us is missing something. Don't ever imagine that you know everything, and don't ever imagine that that you're perfect. And that's the real lesson that Shlomo HaMelech is giving us, King Solomon, is that we need to know that if I'm not perfect, I can't demand perfection from my children either.
Why did Shlomo HaMelech say that? I mean,
what?
That's very interesting.
Chanoich lenar pidako, you should know, first of all, it's a pasuk in Mishlei, in Proverbs. It's an astonishingly powerful verse. right? Each child should be educated according to his. He's giving parenting classes. Now it sounds incredibly obvious, right? I don't know how many of you over here have got how many siblings you've got, but families are really extraordinary things because siblings, you all come from the same parents, you've all got the same DNA, you're all brought up in exactly the same environment, and yet all siblings are different. They've all got their own personalities. They've all got their own. It's something absolutely incredible. And King Solomon is saying, "Chanoch lanal pidako," that you should know that, right? That as a parent, you should know that every child is different, and what's good for one child is not necessarily good for another child, and what's good for the other child is not going to be good for the first child. And you've got to know that and identify that. And the more in tune you are with your children's different personalities, the better is your ability to be able to help them and to educate them. The end of the verse is even more important than the beginning of the verse. The beginning of the verse says, "Chanoch lanal pidako," that we should educate every child according to who they are. But the end of the verse says, why? Ki gam ki yazkin lo yasor mimenu, that when the child gets wiser, when the child gets older, what you've taught him shouldn't disappear from him. Jewish education here, maybe just as a little bit of an aside, but it's something terribly important. Jewish education is not defined by how many degrees you've got. Jewish education is not defined by how many exams you took and how many tests you took and what percent did you get in the various exams that you took. Jewish education is defined by being able to give over information from one generation to the next, in order that generation, the new generation, should have the information to be able to give it over in their own way to the next generation that comes after them. It's like a relay race, right? In a relay race, you're passing over the baton from one person to the other in the hope that it's going to go from, just keep going all the way through to the end. And that's what we're doing as well. We have the baton, our generation has a baton of education, and we have to give it over to the next generation that's coming after us. How are we going to do that? That's what Shlomo HaMelech, that's what King Solomon's talking about. And that's really what Chanukah is all about as well. Chanukah, this idea of revolving around the concept of chinuch, of education, revolving around the idea of the rededication of the temple, that what is important for us is it's not the physical dimensions. It's interesting in Chanukah, we'll see in Mitzvah Hashem with the mitzvahs of Chanukah, that there are no real physical mitzvahs over here. There is no mitzvah to have a meal. There is no mitzvah to make kiddush on Chanukah every night of Chanukah. There really isn't any mitzvah to eat latkes and donuts on Chanukah either. There really isn't. But you hear the idea that the mitzvah of Chanukah is what? It's to light the menorah, right? And the menorah represents the clarity of the light, the clarity of the Torah, the idea of going to war in order to be able to learn Torah. And there's the most astonishing thing, again, the Ramban Nachmanides says, when they came back to rededicate the temple on the 25th of Kislev, the temple was in the most terrible state. The Greeks had been in there, they'd ransacked the place. I mean, this is a famous story where they couldn't find a little pitcher of oil, and there were underground storage rooms that the amount of olive oil that was used was enormous inside of the temple, because there were menorahs that were lit, there was lights that were lit all over the place, there was olive oil that was put onto libation offerings and into meal offerings. I mean, the amount of oil was just extraordinary, and they'd managed to defile everything. And they found one little pitcher of oil that still had the stamp of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, and that's a pitcher of oil that they used, and that's where the story of Chanukah comes from. This idea of
like
kosher oil, right? Real deluxe, super deluxe kosher oil. Again, it was as pure as can be. I don't know if does anybody here know anything about olive oil?
Virgin.
Olive oil is the most astonishing stuff. It really is, but it comes in so many different grades. And you can have olive oil, which is you can't eat, but you can use it for light, for lighting, up to the highest grade of cold pressed extra virgin. And this stuff is got no sediments in it, and everything depends on what kind of olives you're using, what kind of color it is, and what kind of taste it's going to have. And there are connoisseurs in olive oil who some olive oils are hundreds of dollars per bottle. And if you understand from this stuff, it's exactly these people get as much enjoyment from olive oil as they do that connoisseurs get from wine, for example. It's the same kind of thing. And the olive oil that was used to light the menorah in the temple was the coldest, pressiest, virgin, extra, super deluxe olive oil that you could imagine. Because what was it? They took the olives and they poured huge amounts of olives on top of each other so that it was the weight of the olives that was pushing down on the olives at the bottom. It wasn't using something, normally when you press olive oil, how do you do that? You have a great big stone and a trough, and you put the olives in the trough and you put the stone on top and it pushes down, and that's how the oil comes out. But the olive oil that was being produced, especially for the menorah, only for the menorah, you didn't use a stone, but rather used the weight of other olives on top of it, huge amounts of olives pushing down, and only the first drops that came out were used for the menorah. Everything else was used for other things instead, because the very first drops that come out are the purest drops. They've got no dross, no sediment, no nothing inside of them, and they were considered to be, only that was considered to be worthy to use for the menorah. And again,
that's the oil we're talking about.
That's the oil that we're talking about. Again, in the temple, there were huge amounts of oil, right? Huge. There were probably like a football field's worth of storage rooms with pitchers of oil of different grades being used for different things. But there was very, very little of this very special oil that was used for the menorah, and they're looking. Everything's being defiled. The few pitchers that they have been broken open, which means that they can't be used. And they found one small little pitcher of oil, which was going to be good only for one day. And they used it, and it kept alight for 8 days. And that's where the miracle of Chanukah comes from, this idea of lighting for 8 days, and every day adding more and more light as we go along. In Mitzvah Hashem, we'll talk about it. But that's where the origins of the festival comes from. That's what we're commemorating over here. But there's just one thing, one detail that I'd like to just mention over here, which is that the Gemara says that when the Hashmonin, when they finally dedicated the temple, of course the various golden utensils they couldn't find them, they weren't there, they needed to be rededicated as well. In the meantime, what did they do? They built a menorah made out of iron. Shipudim shel Basel, that's the way that the Gemara describes it. They took pieces of iron and they stuck them together, welded them together, one piece in the middle and then pieces coming out on the sides, in order to make a new menorah. And the Ramban Nachmanides points out a very fascinating thing. The halacha is, the Torah says, that it's completely forbidden to use iron or steel in the building of the temple. The temple was a place of peace. These were things that were used for warfare. And subsequently, no metal was supposed to be used except for precious metals like gold and silver, right, and copper, but none of the things that were used for war. Says the Ramban Nachmanides, out of all the things that the Maccabees could have used in order to build the menorah again, why on earth did they use iron, which is forbidden? Right? Shipudim shel Basel, that's the word that it uses, right? So answers the Ramban, because it's absolutely apt that the only time that the Jewish people went to war in order to be able to learn Torah was on Chanukah, that the rededication of the menorah, which represents the light of Torah, should be built with something that you make weapons of war with. Because they used their weapons of war in order to be able to learn Torah, in order to be able to bring Torah back to the Jewish world, so it was very apt that they used that same material be used in order to fabricate the menorah, in order to begin the avodah, the worship inside of the temple again. The Chanukah is all about the concept of continuity. Chanukah is all about the concept of light, of clarity, of purity. There's an incredible one of the later authorities, Rabbi Akiva Eiger says like this, that the halacha says that if everybody is impure, then it's okay to use impure oil in the temple, right? If everything is impure anyway, So it's okay to use impure oil. So he says, why do they go to such trouble in order to find the pure oil and in order to have a miracle come by that it should stay alive for 8 days? He says, because what are they doing? They're rededicating the temple. They're starting all over again, right? When you start something from the beginning, you want to start in the very best way that you can. It should be as pure as possible in order that that purity should be the foundation of everything that's going to be in the future. Here, so it's two different concepts over here, which means that the metal is being used in order to reinforce this idea that they went to war only in order to be able to learn, to continue to learn Torah. It's interesting. That really is Judaism, right? Mixing things together,
Really?
taking the spiritual purity and applying it to something which is physically imperfect. The truth is it's a very interesting symbolism.
No,
it really is. What's the pshat of impure oil? the minute that the Greeks broke open all of the pitchers, then they're now impure. Up until then, everything was stored in the temple. The only difference between the oils was the grade, right? How clean was it? Again, if you look at if you go to a fancy store, you'll see oil. Hopefully they've got it set out according to the different grades, and you can see clearly inside of the bottle itself, right? That the less expensive oil has got a lot more. There's a lot more sediment inside of it, and the real expensive oils are perfectly clear. That's the idea. The idea of the different grades of quality of oil. They were all pure. Presumably, all of the oil that was sitting in the temple had been dedicated for temple use, and that means that you can't take it now and use it for cooking with outside of the temple. The problem is it can't be used in the temple because it's been defiled. the Aruch HaShulchan, one of the great later authorities, just before the Second World War, he writes that the miracle, that there are many different explanations of how to define exactly the miracle of Chanukah. And he says that the miracle of Chanukah is really the fact that the Jewish people drove out this incredible, mighty war machine, and was something which was completely and absolutely unexpected. And only because God, they had God on their side. So I guess that helped in the end, right? So the moral of the story is, it helps to have God on your side, right? Definitely. There you go. Okay, we're going to stop over here, Mitz Hashem.